Did you know that of January 2019, Geddy Lee has a collection of 219 basses? Let's find out what Geddy Lee is all about. Ah, sorry, eh? Shit, I'm doing it again. Geddy Lee originally wanted to be a guitar player, stating, "Nobody chooses to play bass. The band decides this for you."
Well, no one becomes a bass player willingly, I don't think. You get voted to be the bass player when the bass player that was chosen originally quits. And the guy that was supposed to play bass with us, his mother really didn't like him associating with us, so he left. And then they all looked at me and said, "Okay, you're going to be the bass player."
Geddy, after borrowing money from his mother, returned back to the group with a Japanese-made Konora Precision copy. Konoras were common in Toronto in the 1970s. They were a small Canadian import company, sourcing various guitars from different manufacturers across Japan. Geddy then fell in love with the idea of playing bass, because nobody wanted to be a bass player. In 1968, at age just 15, Geddy Lee joined Alex Lifeson in a garage band that would eventually become the Rush we know and love, minus Neil Peart. Rush spent 5 years of steady gigging in the local circuits, parties, school dances, bars, and other small venues in and around Toronto at this time. During this time, Geddy bought a Hagstrom 4-string, which he played for quite a while. Shortly thereafter, he traded the Hagstrom for a 1969 Fender Precision. They released their first album, Rush, independently on their own label, Moon Records. This then led to success with the song Working Man. After the achievement of Rush, the band was offered a 2-record deal with Mercury's Polygram Records in 1974. Moon Records then folded as a label and transformed into a music production company. With the band now signed and another album to be made, Rush were given an advance by the record company. Upon receiving the advance money, Geddy raced out to buy a Rickenbacker 4001 and exclaimed in an interview, "It was the sound that Chris Squire got out of it, and that's the sound that made me want to buy one. Much to my dismay, when I plugged it in, it didn't sound like Chris Squire." After nabbing the 4001, Geddy then began customizing his 1969 Fender Precision and turned it into his space bass, sanding the body into a tear shape, painting crazy reflective colours, and adding a jazz pickup to the bridge for a stereo output. Why though? When asked why the bass was sanded down, Geddy recalled, "I wasn't using it, and it was very beat up from all the years that I had used it. Well, I'm going to do something wild with it." The 4001 was used exclusively to record Fly By Night, with a white 4001 appearing on the music video for Fly By Night and Anthem. Whilst the follow-up album, Crest of Steel, showed Geddy switching between the Fender Precision and the 4001. These two basses would become the backbone of Geddy Lee's arsenal, all the way into 1976, with the Precision being used on stage during the encore. A Farewell to Kings continued with the 4001 as the primary bass. However, this record also introduced some new instruments, like a Rickenbacker 4080 double guitar neck bass. Think Jimmy Page, but with a bass on the top. The double neck is a Model 4001, and the guitar is a standard Rickenbacker with 12 strings. A Rickenbacker 3001 and a Teardrop Precision also made appearances. A new door was opening up to Rush with the addition of electronics, like synthesizer Moogs and Taurus bass pedals. I'll cover keyboards later on in the video. 1978's Hemispheres was more of the same, but now included the 4001 in white and a new Rickenbacker 4002. Geddy continued using all of these basses into permanent waves, hinting in an interview he also used the 4001 and a new 6-string double neck in place of the 12-string. He also admitted he wasn't happy with the overall 12-string part of the set, and in response removed the Rickenbacker pickups for Gibson humbuckers. According to Geddy, it's because the Rickenbacker pickups were terrible. The 3001 and the 4002 were also claimed to be used in the studio. Geddy also expressed some disappointment with his current basses, stating, "I really like Rickenbackers, but because of the wear and tear, every Rickenbacker I've played has a different neck." In an interview from June 1980, Geddy reveals a newly acquired Fender Jazz, which he used on half of the recording. "I recently lucked out and found a 69 or 70 Fender Jazz bass. I used it on about half of Permanent Waves." The bass was later dated to be from 1972. We'll come back to this 72 Fender Jazz as it plays a big role later on. These basses were used to record 1981's Pictures and 1982's Signals. They also appeared on the subsequent tours. While the classic 4001 was replaced over time, it did make a return in the R40 tour and played on Passage to Bangkok. It's only when we get to Grace Under Pressure in 1984 we see a real change, with the introduction of a new Steinberger L2, which took over as Geddy's main bass. Geddy explains, "The Rickenbacker was a very heavy, unwieldy bass to play live. I thought I'd try the Steinberger because it has no headstock and it's a shrimpy little thing, a lot lighter." He figured if he could get the sound he wanted out of this bass, it would reduce the risk of knocking over mic stands and other instruments on stage. 2 EMG soap bar pickups were added to this bass. Ultimately, he says, the sound was not satisfying to me. The Steinberger's last appearance was on the Hold Your Fire tour in 1987. Further changes arrived in 1985, with the introduction of a new Wal bass. The producer, Peter Collins, had one, and suggested Geddy try it out. Geddy praised its results and flexibility, explaining, "I use a 4-string Wal most of the time, but on Lock and Key it was a 5-string. According to the tour programs for the next 8 years, right up to 1993's counterparts, Geddy routinely used a 4 and a 5-string Wal bass. A second Wal bass in red was added during 1989's Presto tour. 1993's platinum-selling album Counterparts, only in Canada, saw the return to an aggressive Rush sound. Geddy remarked in an interview at the time, "Our overall sound had gotten a little polite. I decided to go back to a more aggressive sound." For this album, Geddy ditched his active basses and went old school with his 1972 Fender Jazz, found in a pawn shop in Kalamazoo, Michigan for $200. He added heavier strings for a more substantial bottom end. The Wal, by comparison, was strung up with much lighter funk masters. This 1972 Fender Jazz would become Geddy's main bass and follow him through his career even to present day. At every opportunity, Geddy praises this bass, saying there's just something special about it.
Like I have now, I don't know, 25 jazz basses. And none of them sound exactly like that bass. So there's a particular mojo to that instrument.
The Black 72 was just the beginning, and it was around this period where a flood of Fender Jazzes made way into Geddy's rig. As Geddy stated in 2015, he has about 25 different jazz basses, so it's unclear where to draw the line on basses used in Rush and basses just in his collection. To keep things simple, we're going to focus on the core basses seen between 1996 and 2015. This also covers his solo album, My Favorite Headache, released in 2000. A full list of jazz basses and everything else Geddy has used can be found in the show notes linked up above or found down below. Interviews with Geddy's bass techs list the following basses used during this period. There's the Black Fender 72. This is the main bass that all the other basses are compared to. Then a 72 in Sunburst, only a few hundred serial numbers away from the Black 72, and notably used as a main backup. It's played on 7 Cities of Gold and Wish Them Well. The third bass is a second Black Jazz from 1974, typically used to play Bravado. A Fender Jazz custom shop joined the ranks in 1996 with a candy apple red finish, and primarily used on the song Circumstances. 1998, however, saw the general release of the Geddy Lee Jazz Bass. It was crafted in Japan and created as a reproduction of the #1 72 bass. Fender also released a Sunburst model, which followed in 2009, and a revised USA version in 2015, made in America this time, but with a slightly different neck finish. White perlioid block inlays and a Fender high mass bridge. 2 stock Geddy Lee signatures, one in black and one in Sunburst, were used as backups to the main basses. Speaking of the custom shop, the 72 and the 74 were both frequent visitors. The 72 has seen around 4 new necks, with the 74 having at least 1 neck change in 2010. Both basses have their original pickups, but were rewound to original specs. But the 74 has said to have a little more mojo in it. Whatever that means, you'll just have to ask Jim Morrison. During the recording of Snakes and Arrows around 2006, Fender sent Geddy Lee a Jaco Pastorius tribute fretless and fretted bass. The fretless was used live on Malignant Narcissism. Fretless basses never really took a hold on Geddy. He admits that playing one is scary and is usually a failure. The rest of Geddy's basses are fitted with Fender custom shop pickups, created by Tom Brantley in 2010. The 72 would be used to record Counterparts, Test for Echo, My Favorite Headache, Vapor Trails, Snakes and Arrows, and Clockwork Angels, with the other basses filling in gaps on specific parts, and appearing on subsequent tours. On the Clockwork Angels tour in 2012, the jazz bassist returned with custom engraved pickguards denoting alchemy symbols. The 72 was engraved with a symbol for amalgamation, meaning the process to bind two entities into one. A new custom jazz bass in surf green also joined the ranks at this time. In 2015, Rush embarked on the R40 live tour, which commemorated the 40th anniversary of Neil Peart joining the band in 1974. The basses used on this tour were a little bit unusual, and Geddy explains it best in the R40 tour book. Somewhere around the rehearsal phase of Clockwork Angels tour, I began a 2-year journey of searching for vintage basses that told a story to us. I have chosen to share the sound and glory of some of those instruments with you all on the R40 tour. Even though I did not play these exact instruments on the original recordings, I have tried to choose ones that enhance the music in one way or another. I hope you will enjoy this parade through time and will dig the experience of hearing these fantastic instruments as much as I will enjoy playing them. 26 basses make appearances in this tour. As usual, full list can be found in the show notes linked down below. While R40 wasn't planned as a farewell tour, the band did have their suspicions. The tour became incredibly painful for Neil Peart, who had a number of ailments exacerbated by the tour. He had been hospitalised for anemia, from bleeding ulcers, and suffered breathing problems, as well as suffering from psoriatic arthritis and chronic tendinitis, with frequent administration of cortisol injections just to get him through the tour. The 2016 documentary Rush, Time Stands Still, discusses Neil's decline in open and frank terms and is well worth a watch. Geddy stated in a 2018 interview that there are zero plans to tour and no chance of seeing Rush on tour again as Alex, Geddy and Neil. In the following years following R40, Geddy has kept busy writing a book, Geddy Lee's Big Beautiful Book of Bass. He had a simple yet impossible goal, to figure out exactly why his 72 Jazz sounded the way it did. Geddy explains, "I couldn't find a backup that was its equal. You ask yourself why? That's the question that pervades the book. Why do certain years turn out to be so much more desirable and great sounding than other years?" Geddy, in his curiosity, decided he was going to buy a jazz bass from every year, from 1960 to 1972, and compare them from the inside out. But it didn't stop there.
One of the motivations for doing the book, among the many motivations I had, was to kind of showcase photographically how unique and beautiful these instruments can be. There's a lot of books out there about guitars and vintage guitars and collecting guitars, but I felt like the books on bass were a bit meager and didn't really show the love that I felt the bass deserved. So I wanted to sort of make a beautiful book. That's why the title is what it is.
The 408-page tome, Big Beautiful Book of Bass, was released in December 2018. More information is down below. Next, we jump into Geddy Lee's amplifiers and backline. Geddy's first real amplifier was a Traynor 2x15. Prior to joining Rush, Alex would routinely call Geddy and ask to borrow his amp. Taking influence from John Entwistle, Geddy bought a Sun 2000S tube head and two matching 2x15 cabinets in 1972, changing the stock speakers for Electro Voice SROs. When Geddy bought his 4001, he envisioned using it in stereo. This model features a stereo Rickenbackers sound output socket, allowing each pickup to be routed to different amplifiers or effects chains. He then bought a second wave of amplifiers, using an Ampeg SVT and 2x15 V4B cabinets for his bass pickup, and the Sun rig for his treble. The Ampegs were sent to front of house using a DI, and the Sun amps were mic'd up on stage. This general setup recorded the albums and played on the subsequent tours between 1974 and 1978. For the recording of 78's Hemispheres, a few new items joined the lineup: two BGW amplifiers and Ashley preamps. Again, taking advantage of the stereo Rickenbackers sound output and using one stack for the bass and the other for the treble. The bottom end still went to the Ampeg V4Bs, and the top end now went to two new 15-inch teal line cabinets, fitted with EV speakers. These small cabinets are designed with a bass reflex port, allowing the player to better shape their bottom end. The double neck Rickenbackers also used different amplifiers, with the 6 and a 12 string being played through a Fender Twin Reverb. This was then upgraded to a Yamaha solid state amplifier in 1981. A custom switch was used to route the guitar to the correct amplifier, as the 4080s only had one output for both bass and guitar. Continuing with 1981, a Furman PQ3 and an API 5500 replaced the Ashley preamps. This then continued into a custom switcher box, routing to BGW power amps. In the tour program for Grace Under Pressure, the BGW was replaced with a newer model, the 750C. Geddy also lists the following custom cabinets: a special Brother Russell mystery speaker cabinet, built by monks somewhere in Arizona, with two 15-inch speakers in each. No, I don't know what they are either. These cabs were also present on the Power Windows tour, and said to be used up to the Roll the Bones tour in 1991. During the recording of Roll the Bones, Geddy commented that most of the sound is DI'd, and that he used a Gallien-Kruger amp, mic'd. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to narrow down what amp specifically. Some have suggested he used the GK800, which was making rounds at the time. I haven't seen pictorial evidence, but it's not too far-fetched to believe. Alex was endorsed by GK, so it's possible other gear could have been provided. Also, speaking of DIs, DIs have a crucial role in Geddy's sound, which we'll cover in great detail in a minute. One interview speaks of Geddy returning to the Ampeg SVT and using a Trace Elliot 4x10 cab to record counterparts. Trace Elliot gear then became a core part of his backline between 1993 and 2007, using a Quattro power amp with GP12 preamps. Earlier versions of the rig also included a Tech 21 Landmark 600. This was paired with a standard 1x18 cab and two 4x10 speaker cabs. The cabinets changed from your typical Trace cabs in 1996 to what looks like a Trace Elliot V-type setup. Note the change in the logo and the grey dust cloth. Trace cabs usually have a solid black grille, and the V-type is the only model that looks similar. If you know exactly what model this is, let me know in the comments down below. In the final lineup of amplifiers, joining the rig around 2007 and used on the Snakes and Arrows tour, Geddy used an orange AD200 bass head with two 4x10 bass cabinets. This setup was also used to record Clockwork Angels. The producer, Nick Raskolinsk, suggested he use them. "It just added this crazy wild distortion that I liked a lot," exclaimed Geddy. "It seemed so successful that I called them up and asked if they could send me a couple to use live. And they did, setting him up with an endorsement too. And the orange heads have been with Geddy right up to present day." Amplifiers are just one aspect of Geddy's sound, so let's backtrack to 1993. It's around this period where DIs, direct inputs, direct injections, direct boxes, or whatever your colloquial name may be, start to become prevalent. It's direct input, by the way. Bloody direct boxes. While Geddy did have some miking of the cabs over the previous tours, he always fed a direct line to the front of house, and had the engineer combine the feeds together. That is his job after all, I should know. 1993 or thereabouts is the earliest record of Geddy experimenting with DIs, ending up with a trifecta of DI'd sounds. He stated, "I've been experimenting the last few years, using 3 types of speaker simulators, out of a need to develop something that I could use at home rather easily." It all started with a Palmer speaker simulator, and in most of the interviews that I've read, Palmer Speaker Simulator has been used interchangeably between the PDI-03 and the PDI-05. Either way, interviews show evidence of him using both. If you want my opinion, it looks like the PDI-03 was used in his home studio and the PDI-05 on the road. The Palmer gives Geddy a bizarre air speaker movement and a really controllable distortion. Then there's a Tech 21 Sans amp. Again, he doesn't always specify which Sans amp specifically. However, we do know he used a Sans amp space driver and a PSA-1 around 2001. A Sans amp RBI was also reported in 2002, before switching to the newer RPM model after auditioning it in his home studio. The RPM sound has a little more detail than the RBI, and the distortion is a little more controllable. Lastly in this trifecta is the Avalon U5, giving Geddy a really deep, clear sounding bass, and lots of flexibility when it comes to the mix. As Geddy says, he did a lot of experimenting. A Martech and a Deventer Tube DI were also used early on, but didn't make the cut. So how does this all fit together? The signal goes from the bass into a wireless receiver, usually Shure or Samsung, then into a Kitty Hawk MIDI looper. This switcher acts as a mute while changing basses. From the Kitty Hawk, the signal goes into an Axis electronic splitter, with a feed inserted into the RPM. A split is sent to the PDI-05, and a second channel is routed to the orange AD200. A tube amp works well when it's turned up loud. As there's no cabs on stage, the amp is connected to a rock crusher attenuator, which provides the loads for the heads. All that power has to go somewhere. Lastly, a fourth feed is sent to the Avalon. The 4 outputs are then sent to front of house and combined to make a gritty, dirty, but clean bass sound. The doubles of these units are spares or backups. As a result of using DIs, the idea of an amplifier rig wasn't really necessary anymore. As early as 1992, Geddy describes the wonders of using in-ear monitors on stage in place of stage volume. I'm wearing in-ear monitors now. I have absolutely no need for speakers on stage. Everything is coming through the PA, so it's not like the crowd is going to benefit from speakers on stage. The only caveat to this is the stage has some light 15-inch subs. Monitor engineer Brent Carpenter goes into more detail.
One of the things that I like to do with my bands, is I always put subs on the stage. I cross them over really, really low, so it's just the really lowest notes. And I only put low-end energy in them. The bass drum, maybe a floor tom, the bass guitar. If there's a Taurus pedal or a really low keyboard note, I like to put that in them as well. Doing that attaches the musician to the stage. Especially since we don't have bass cabinets or guitar cabinets on stage, it allows me to put some low end on stage that they can feel their own instrument a little bit.
Beginning in 2002, Geddy dispensed with traditional bass amplifiers, in favour of the already mentioned DI units and in-ear monitors. Faced with the dilemma of what to do with the empty space left on stage by the amplifier cabinets, Geddy chose to decorate his side of the stage with some very unusual items, starting off with a fridge, a workable vending machine, then MyTag spin dryers, which would rotate during a show, and the band would empty the dryers to throw t-shirts into the crowd. Then Henhouse brand chicken rotisserie, which does look like an amplifier in a weird way. It was mic'd up for comic effect. Lastly, the Time Machine tour in 2010 saw the introduction of the Geddison, a steampunk-inspired time machine and sausage maker combo. A second iteration of the Geddison returned in 2012 on the Clockwork Angels tour, and this time made popcorn on stage. When it comes to effects pedals, Geddy is very modest about the whole thing. He doesn't tend to give them much consideration as part of his sound. As a result, there isn't really that much by way of information. Instead, it would seem we see minor audio flourishes from the front of house engineers. In 2017, Tech 21 released a Geddy Lee Sync to Sans amp, named the Ged 2112. It saw use in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame performance with Yes, with Geddy stating he just took that to play the performance. For those of us that don't have a rack, the Geddy Lee YYZ is a fantastic alternative. Speaking of the YYZ, I have a special treat for you guys. Tech 21 has kindly joined me for an interview on the release of the YYZ. We talk about the design process and some of the challenge they face when designing this pedal. A link is up above and in the description. Go and watch it. Let's finish up the bass and guitars with some strings and miscellaneous. Originally, when Geddy started playing bass, he was using the Bella flat wound strings. A big turning point came for Geddy in 1974 when recording Rush. This time he used a Rotor Sound swing bass set and was amazed at the discovery of high end in his tone. With the introduction of the wall bass back in 1985, Geddy changed to super wound funk masters, stating that they're much lighter than I was used to. They gave me more definition, especially in the upper ranges. The Funkmasters fell out of favour by 1990, with a return to the Rotor Sound swing bass set, and he's been using them ever since. The only other gear Geddy uses is a Leo Kwan Badass Bridge 2, which has been fit on more or less every bass Geddy has used over the years at some point or another. These bridges are used to add sustain and give a longer intonation adjustment. They also lock down the saddles, which can be an issue on some early Fender models. On most of the Fender Geddy Lee jazz basses, they've created their own high mass bridge, more or less performing the same way. So that's Geddy's bass rig. And what's that? What's that you say? Keyboards. Keyboards. Well, today's your lucky day, my friends. I hope you like keyboards because he's got a bloody lot of them. There is a lot of gear in this section, so if you just want a simple list, I've made a Geddy Lee cheat sheet which you can download for free. Check out the description for more information. Keyboard/synthesizers started showing up on the recording of 1977's Farewell to Kings, providing a major stylistic and substantive rejuvenation within the band. In an interview with Neil Peart, he described the era as a musical dilemma, with Rush considering hiring a new member and new gear to progress forward. Geddy's role expanded from a lead singer bassist to occasional rhythm guitarist and multi-keyboardist. Several intricate bass lines and synthesizer parts are accomplished by foot, whilst his hands are busy elsewhere. Starting small, Geddy used a Moog Taurus pedal and a Mini Moog. Originally, Geddy got the Taurus pedals because he wanted to play guitar and keep the bass going. The Taurus was used with 4 preset bass sounds and 1 variable high-end synthesizer sound, allowing Geddy to essentially continue a bass line up another octave. Speaking in 1981, Geddy said, "We added the pieces slowly over the last 3 or 4 years. I started out with simple bass pedals till it became the monster it is today." Rumour has it, the low E of a Mini Moog even caused a woman to go into labour.
I remember a friend of mine was pregnant, came to see us. She still swears to this day that all the bottom end from the show forced her to go into labor a little earlier than she would have. The baby was going mental, and it was like less than a day later she was in labor. The Taurus pedals makes babies come faster.
True story. The Mini Moog then became a tool to write lead and melody parts, such as the intro to Farewell to Kings. Both the Mini Moog and the Taurus pedals were a key part of his keyboard rig between 1978 and 1984. After that, some interviews do mention the Taurus pedals and the Mini Moog, but it was no longer the focal point for the keys. The Taurus pedals were replaced by a Korg MPK 130 during the 80s. The additions came through at a natural pace, piece by piece, with Geddy taking his time getting to know each instrument before moving on to the next. A Roland Space Echo and an Oberheim 8-voice polyphonic was intended to be used on 1978's Hemispheres. Unfortunately, the 8-voice suffered technical issues on a flight from Canada to Rockfield Studios in Wales. It did, however, take part in the following tour. The main draw of the 8-voice was its memory bank, allowing 16 presets to be stored. This was then controlled by keyboard and Taurus pedals. It derives its polyphony from having 8 monosynth modules hardwired together. It was used primarily to produce string and air horns, as well as some natural types of things. An Obi-Wan keyboard? No, not that Obi-Wan. With an Oberheim digital sequencer followed in 1979, and was used strictly for weird sounds and sequencing parts. Following suit came an OB-X and an OB-8, both interfaced with a second set of Taurus pedals. I hope you're comfortable, this is going to take a while. The Signals tour in 1982 introduced the newer OB-XA, which is said to be a little more forward or aggressive sounding compared to the OB-X. This was paired with an Oberheim DSX sequencer, which again interfaced with the Taurus pedals. Also introduced was a Roland Jupiter and a TR-808 drum machine, working in conjunction with a Mini Moog and a Yamaha delay. Oberheim equipment left the rig around 1985. In its place, a PPG Wave 2.2 was added during 1984's Grace Under Pressure tour, with Geddy giving it gold star praise, citing its compatibility to utilize digital and analog synthesis, its crystal clear clarity and user friendliness. For power windows in 1985, the now classic Yamaha DX7 and 2 KX76s were used to trigger a KX1 sequencer, and 5 Emulator 2 computerized synthesizers. These were loaded offstage with up to 108-inch floppy disks. Gah, remember those days? No, me neither. Akai S900 samplers came in around 1987 and were supported by 2 Prophet VS synths, as well as a PPG 2.3 now with a Roland D550 synth, controlled with additional Korg MIDI pedals. A similar Roland D50 keyboard and S77 sampler followed in 1991, with Geddy mentioning he was highly dependent on them for the upcoming tour. This was carried in tow with a Korg Wave Station and a Yamaha PF80. The Test for Echo tour saw a more traditional synth-type system, with a Roland D50 as the master controller, a JD800, the Prophet VS keys, and a Roland JV1080 expandable synth module. Geddy used the D50's controller to call up various programs needed for the show. The system is routed by a MIDI switching matrix and 2 JL Cooper 1620s. In total, there were 6 controllers for playback, with Geddy using 4 directly, mainly the DX7, the Prophet VS, and a pair of Korg MPK pedals. One set was positioned at the keyboard, and the second set at its mic stand centre stage. Mixing it up in 2002, a Roland VX5080 sampler was used on Vapor Trails, as well as a brief encounter with a Mellotron. It's time to thin this rig out a bit, don't you think? Between 2007's Snakes and Arrows tour and 2012's Clockwork Angels tour, we saw a more refined setup, with a Phantom X7 and a Moog Little Fatty digital synthesizer. While the Roland produces the odd sound, Primary function is to control the bank of Roland XV 5080s that reside off stage. These samplers are also triggered by using 2 sets of Korg MPK 130 pedals. Apart from that, there's a bunch of associated MIDI gear, like computers, switches, signal change, et.al., which I put in the show notes. Don't forget the show notes will list everything covered in the video today, like names, dates and model numbers. There are so many tiny details in this rig, it's hard to put them all into one video. On the next Know Your Bass Player, I will be returning to the votes laid out earlier in the year. If you're new here, take a look at the voting video and cast your vote. Just don't vote for Geddy Lee, as that is a wasted vote, my friend. Right this second, it looks like Tim Comerford is in the lead, but if you're not a fan, you can change that, so get voting. If you don't like those guys, let me know who you would like to see and leave a comment down below. Thank you again to everyone who voted earlier in the year and left feedback for the channel. There's a lot of suggestions that I'll be looking into and developing in the near future, so stay tuned for that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.